Hello everyone, and welcome to Ellie webinar on business-driven data modeling. My name is Juha Korpela. I'm the Chief Product Officer for Ellie Technologies, and I will be joined in just a few minutes by Alec Sharp from Canada. Let me go through some practical details first here. So this webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. We will be recording the webinar in its entirety. So the recording will be made available for you after this webinar has ended. And let's go through the agenda very soon. I think now we have Alec Sharp online. Hi, Alec.
Hello.
Hi. Good to have you there. So let me.
I hope so.
Yeah, there we go. Let me introduce to you my friend Alec Sharp. So Alec's been working on data management and process management for what? Decades? And he's joining us from live from Vancouver, Canada. So what we will be doing is we will be discussing first Alec's points on business-driven data and why is it so important. So Alec will go through I think you will talk about the kind of basics of conceptual data modeling and what it means and why is it important and your experiences with the topic. And after that, I will go through a very, very brief demo of Ellie, our conceptual data modeling tool, and how it works in very quick demo overview of that. After which we will discuss a little bit about how these conceptual data models are utilized in, for example, data platform projects. And after that, we will have some time for questions and answers. So if you have questions during the show here, you are welcome to write down anything you might have in your mind into the chat. We have Johannes from Ellie there to assist you with any practical questions, and he will be also picking up some good questions for me and Alec to discuss after the presentations there. I hope this sounds good to everyone. So Alec, if you are ready, I think this might be your go notice here for your presentation. Feel free to start.
Okay, this may well be my cue. So let me just turn some screen sharing on. And I'm in the Hall of Mirrors. There we go. There we go. So hello, everybody, and greetings from beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here, so still pretty dark. But I'm feeling bright. I'm excited to be able to talk about my favorite topic, which is concept modeling. And one of the interesting developments in my consulting business and my training business over the last few years has been this amazing resurgence of the interest in concept modeling. Because what we're seeing is in the workshops that I run, for instance, through Ari Hovi in Helsinki, we're getting people who wouldn't have showed up in a concept modeling or data modeling class a few years ago. Agile developers, people into BI, ETL developers, and then really interestingly, data scientists, people working in the Internet of Things, lots of data lake people, and everybody else who needs to understand what are these business people talking about? And that's what data modeling or concept modeling is all about. It's all about communication. So I'd like to start with an idea on modeling with a favorite quote from George Box, which is essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. And he stresses that models are approximations. They are not the real world. And actually, an economical model, a simple model, can be incredibly useful because you can't make a model better by excessive elaboration. Adding more detail to something that is fundamentally flawed is not going to be helpful. So, on the contrary, following William of Occam's dictates, you may You may, if you studied philosophy, know him from Occam's razor fame. Always choose the simplest alternative. We should seek an economical description, okay? Because the ability to devise simple but evocative models, models that engage people and interest them, is the signature of the great scientist or analyst, and over elaboration might be the mark of mediocrity. So what we want to look at is a simple model that actually engages people in communication, and that's a concept model. And this is basically a description of a business, just like an org chart or a process model describes a business. Concept model describes a business in terms of the things it needs to know about. So here's the beginning of a simple concept model. And it might not seem particularly important to you, but even having agreed on these terms, course and section, that's a big deal, because I've been in a lot of large universities and they might refer to this as an offering and a class, or a class and a class offering. So simply establishing terminology is the starting point of concept modeling. So we focus on the things first, the data comes later. Then we want to know the facts about those things, including what are the relationships or associations between them that we need to know about. And finally, what are the individual attributes? Now it's starting to look a little bit more like a data model, especially when we start to add some of the policies and rules to it. But remember, it was really a useful model right back here when it was nothing but what are the things and what are we going to call them? And this concept model is a picture of the real world. It's not a database design. And as my friend Graham Witt says, it is a narrative supported by a graphic. So yes, it has a graphic component. Just as important is the narrative component, where we have definitions and assertions, statements of the rules that the model enforces. And this is critical. This can be comprehended by mere mortals, at least initially. And a lot of experienced data modelers miss the point. They start out with these incredibly elaborate fifth normal form data models that are really just thinly disguised physical database designs. Okay? So this is borrowed from my other friend, Graham Simpson, co-author with Graham Witt of Data Modeling Essentials, who described a situation when somebody began a data model presentation by saying, let's start here with the special tax rate variation comment type, buried way into the details. When we do modeling, we want to do the opposite. We want to mask unnecessary detail. We want to highlight what matters. And I'm going to touch on this a little later. We want to use visual cues consistently. The actual graphic should communicate to us. And so we're going to focus on the direction in a data model, the simplicity of the data model, abstracting up to a useful level, and minimizing visual widgets, just using the minimal number of symbols. So we're talking about concept modeling here, or conceptual modeling. That's one of three major kinds of models or perspectives. So when we talk about a conceptual model, we are only showing the main entities. We have lots of many-to-many relationships. We don't worry about keys or normalizations. That's quite different than what a lot of people think of as a data model, which is the logical model, very close to a physical database design, where we're showing the most granular entities, atomic attributes, the resolution of all the many-to-many relationships, and so on. So this, the concept model, is going to be our focus today. Okay. So some of the central ideas I'm going to touch on. confusing data modeling with database design has over the years discouraged the use of data modeling or concept modeling. And frankly, I blame some of the tools that really emphasized pretty much table-level physical database design, unlike Ellie, which is a very business-friendly tool which focuses on the things and what we need to know about them. So even professional data modelers often overcomplicate and confuse this. And surprisingly, and this is one of the reasons we don't use the term data modeling as often as we used to, data isn't initially the issue. We're modeling the things that a business cares about. The product, the service, the location, the site, the customer, the order, and so on. So I have a mantra in modeling, which is things first, data later. Okay? And what we're going to see is that a business-oriented concept model is a great platform for all kinds of other work. So here's a little bit of a trip down memory lane, a very useful but somewhat painful learning experience for me. I was consulting at a railway, and I was assigned to build a concept model for that railway's track and structures group. These were basically the engineers who built the railway lines, the bridges, the tunnels, and so on. And I began, unfortunately, by explaining data modeling. And I told them fascinating things like an entity is a uniquely identifiable person, place, thing, event, concept, or organization, blah, blah, blah. This turned out to be a very bad idea. The senior engineer in the room stood up and in very colorful language pointed at me and said, "I can't stand you IT guys." And I said, I'm sorry, what's the issue? And he said, "You're always coming down here and teaching us your language. I wish just for once one of you would come down and learn our language." And I was, I guess, thunderstruck. This was so clear and obvious. And so I said, well, that's a fair point. You have your own language. Tell me your language. Tell me the terms that you use on a daily basis that maybe I wouldn't hear in marketing or customer service. And they very quickly brainstormed a list of over 200 terms: track, structure, facility, siding, meet, route, and so on. And then I thought, oh boy, now what am I going to do? And then I looked at this list and I realized everything on the list was either a thing, which as a data modeler I recognize as an entity, or it's a fact about a thing, or it's other stuff like a system or a report or a form. So using a different example, a project management example I use in one of my workshops, we went through the list of terms, and if something was a fact, we put a tick mark next to it. If it was other stuff, we put a box around it. And if it was a thing, we circled it and put it on a chart along with its facts. And nobody had any problem grasping what we were doing here. Eventually, I introduced criteria for something to be a thing. But what was interesting was people kind of just got it intuitively. And we ended up with a really good 35 or 40 entity concept model that the business people were very pleased with. So that's my first lesson here. When you're starting this, it all starts with language. And so what I typically do is interview business people about what they care about. Tell me about your area. What are your activities? What are your goals and objectives, needs and wants, likes and dislikes? And then honestly, I kind of nod sympathetically, but ignore a lot of it. I don't dive into the detail. Instead, I capture the terms. I listen for anything that is a noun, anything that is a term describing something they deal with. Later, I'll write all those terms each on a large Post-it, in a facilitated session, bring people together and start sorting those terms into categories. As I showed you on the last slide, everything is either a thing, a fact about a thing, or other stuff. And other stuff could include metrics, which are calculations based on other facts, could be the name of performers who do the work or activities, information mechanisms, and so on. So here's a quick example. I was working a few years ago at a regulatory agency that wanted to change their business model, inspecting, manufacturing and office locations for safety. And the change they wanted to make was going to actually cause a lot of difficulty for the IT and finance people. So what they hired me to do was come in and look at the situation and see if I could help come up with a process that would make some of their ideas work and determine the most essential IT requirements, the main changes that were going to be necessary to make this new regime possible. And even though it was a process job and an IT requirements job, concept modeling turned out to be the most important part of this assignment. So I interviewed business people about their area, what they did, what they cared about, and I ended up with a list of terms. Now, I've shown these as stickies or Post-its from Miro, but I want to stress that because of the collaborative nature of Ellie, Ellie is a perfect tool for doing this kind of work. So we can just identify what are the key nouns that people use in conversation, and I've carefully selected 20 or so out of the 200 or more that they identified, and then I just had them identify synonyms. I didn't go looking for entities. I just said, are some of these terms really meaning the same thing? And it turned out, yeah, they did. And people were surprised at how many different terms they used for the same basic ideas. So we selected some terms to use for this initiative: client, facility, unit, client safety management plan, authorization. And then I asked a simple question. How do these relate? What kind of connections do you need to know between these things? What facts do you need to know about them? What are some of the policies that govern them? And we ended up fairly quickly with a very simple concept model. Now, I've shown it here with, Post-its and flip charts. But again, in this virtual world we're living in now, this is a perfect application of a tool like Ellie. So their initial model, pretty good, got people talking, wasn't quite right. For instance, it showed that a unit was dependent on a facility. Later, we discovered, no, that's not quite true. And let me point out, we're not putting in primary keys or crow's feet or other widgets. We're just talking about the terms and the relationships between them. Eventually, we clean this up. For instance, now we can see that a unit could be located at many facilities over its lifetime, but only one at a time. And we had resolved questions like, who gets the program authorization? Is it the client or the facility? So here's what we ended up with: a quick conceptual model. Okay? And this raised a lot of questions that the client had not thought about. And this is one of the most important things about concept modeling. It gets people thinking about topics they might have glossed over or not thought about before, like who gets the authorization? What is actually inspected? Are we inspecting a facility or inspecting a unit? And then, in terms of IT requirements, this is a great starting point. Once we have clarified the language, established important policies and rules, now we can use this as the basis for understanding our events and therefore the core services or functions our IT solution has to support. So for instance, a unit is registered. So we need the service to register a unit. A unit is loaded. That means it's brought into operation. So we need the service to load a unit and so on. So this is a great starting point for understanding our requirements. And by the way, the next thing we did was say, well, who needs access to this service? For instance, the client needs the ability to register a unit via our portal, and that took us into the world of use cases and user stories. So starting with a concept model was a great point to start with, and we did all of this without doing any data modeling terminology. We didn't talk about entities or relationships or attributes. It was just things and what we need to know about them. And of course, some definitions and rules. Okay, so closing out, just want to cover a couple of important tips. The most important tip is don't be shy about looking for a definition of the things. Like, what do you actually mean by a client? So I teach people the most important question in this field. You stroke your chin, you look thoughtful like your philosophy professor, and say, what do you actually mean by a client or a facility or a unit? So here's a picture from, I think that was from the university in Seattle. The Finns do everything their own way. So here's a picture of some guys, Tero and my friends up in Helsinki, asking, what do you mean by? And they later sent me a picture. They said, hey, found a picture of you on the net. Me asking, what do you mean by? Now, let me emphasize this. There is no shame in asking, what do you mean by whatever? In fact, one of my favorite examples was working with a group of engineers at Intel, the world's largest chip maker. And I asked, well, what do you actually mean by a chip? And they thought that was kind of a crazy question until they started answering. And they realized within that room, there were 7 different definitions of a chip. Everything from a single square of silicon, a die with logic burned into it, up to an entire product family, like Core i5 or Core i7. So never be afraid to ask, what do you actually mean? And one of my examples that I like came from a transit system I operated where I worked at. What do you mean by a bus? And some people meant the actual physical bus. Some people meant the route. Some people meant the actual departure of a route on a particular day. So everybody in a transit system knows what a bus is, but there's no shame in asking. And then another tip, when we are identifying entities, the most difficult problem that business people are going to have is separating the artifacts from the fundamental things. So forms, spreadsheets, logs, rosters, lists, catalogs, those are not things. Those are artifacts that we can build typically from the facts that we know about multiple things. And the other common problem is failing to separate the types and the instances. For instance, in that example I showed you a minute ago, there was a type of bus, the make or model provided by a manufacturer, and then there was the individual bus, the individual vehicle with its own serial number and in-service date and so on. So there's 2 common errors that we see repeatedly. So we can have people in a room talking about a vehicle, but they may actually be talking about 3 different things. And finally, my last tip is about consistency in drawing and developing your models. People will pick up data modeling intuitively if you treat it simply as a way to describe their business. not trying to teach them data modeling, and you always draw the same kinds of things the same way. So I strictly draw my models top down by dependency, just as I draw my process models left to right by sequence and dependency. So if you have an associative entity, a thing that exists to link to other entities, there's lots of ways you could draw it, but I always do it the same way, with the parent entities above and the associative below. So here's a bit of a cheat sheet using the no dead crows principle. That is that the crow's feet, the many on a relationship, always point down or sideways. So our independent entities are up at the top of the model. Our characteristics, repeating detail about a parent, are below. Associative entities that link to other things are between and below, and reference entities, our code sets and lookup tables and so on, I draw diagonally off to the side. So simply by looking at the diagram, I can tell what kind of entity I'm talking about. And the important thing is business people love these kinds of models drawn top down by dependency. It makes it really easy to start with the big ticket items on the top and then go down through progressive levels of detail. And by the way, this is for operational data, our fundamental entities. Of course, if we're doing a dimensional modeling, our guidelines are a little bit different. So there's lots of different ways we can draw these things, but I find in practice top down by dependency works the best. And I want to close by reminding you it all starts with language. So this is a very old cartoon by Gary Larson. This fellow here may not realize it, but he's maybe a Neanderthal data modeler, and he has clarified things by giving them a name. For instance, this is a house, not a dwelling, not a domicile, not a personal habitation unit, a house. So concept modeling or conceptual data modeling is incredibly important to any kind of work because the things that we define in our concept model are the things our processes act on, that our business intelligence systems report on, that our applications revolve around. So businesses, especially in this complex era, need a common language more than ever, and that's what the concept model does for us. So I hope you'll just do it. I hope you'll go forth and model. And with that, I'm going to thank you and turn it back over to my friends, Juha and Pira.
All right. Thank you, Alec.
Okay, so are you back on your screen now?
Yeah, just a moment. If you would...
I will just end the screen share.
You?
There we go. That was fun.
All right, thank you, Alec. That was super great info, and I really think that the "what do you mean by" thing is one of the most important tips that the data modeler could have.
Absolutely.
I will now go a little bit more into details on first of all how we will do that. What Alec just told you with Ellie in just a few minutes. You can get a more detailed demo if you like from us later on. There's the offers button somewhere there to contact us. And after that, I'll go further into use cases of how this is actually useful, especially in terms of building these large enterprise level data platforms, which is the kind of main topic for me today. But yeah, are we back online? All right, perfect. So let's have a look at the data model. So as you see, this is now a data model in Ellie. This has been created with Ellie. You might notice that it has been created applying Alec's methods, but I'll show you how that actually works. So let me just quickly switch over to Ellie here. There we go. This is my personal Ellie environment. That's one of the perks in working in this company. And what I'll quickly do is just create you a model of production. This is now industrial production. And how Ellie works is that you get this empty canvas and you just start typing your things into Ellie. And these things basically create a business glossary for you. So I already have some items here, so I know that we want to have factories. Yes, factory is a good thing. And we want to have production lines. Okay, that's also a very good thing there. Oh, not that one, but perhaps a production line here. There we go. And we have products which are produced in a production line. And this creates then, I don't know, like maybe deliveries out of those items. So drawing this in Ellie is super simple, and we want to keep it simple because we need this to be so easy to understand and use that the business users can utilize it. So we are adding the crow's feet here. We are saying that the production lines are dependent on the factories. They cannot exist without one. And different sorts of products can be produced in different production lines. So this is now here a many-to-many relationship. Now the production lines can produce something, and these are coming out as deliveries, or we could have, output batches of products there and so on and so forth, which are then passed over to customers who are also independent creatures, and the delivery is made from a production line to a customer and so on and so forth. So this is basically how you build these things. The colors here have a meaning, and in Ellie we have this idea that to make it even more easier to read, we are identifying kind of master data type entities, so things that you can basically list how many of those you have. And there are transaction entities, which are basically just, transactions which happen on a given moment. And we have a couple of others. I'm not going to go into further details on those at this point. But basically, this is how you draw the models. And then the question of what do you mean by, that can be answered with Ellie's glossary. So you double click on the product here, for example, and here you have a place where you can write down what do you mean by a product. So I'm not going to spend time here writing down things, but the idea is that everyone then utilizing this model and seeing the model that we've drawn could see the descriptions of these entities, and we could add examples, synonyms, and even attributes of the product, so IDs, names, something like that here. So this then eventually creates a glossary of all the things that you've added in your models. And this is now my personal test environment, so I have all sorts of stuff here, but you can see that I have at some point created a customer thing, a customer entity, and written down here what do I mean by a customer. And now whenever I create new models, the same customer entity comes up if I need it, and I can link it to yet more models, and eventually Ellie then tracks how I have used this particular entity across all my models. And that sort of starts to give me an idea of what are the important data concepts in the world, the real business world. So this is how this works, and it is very, very easy to share these models. Ellie works in a browser tab. It's fully web-based SaaS service, so no one needs to install anything. I can give just people access to my Ellie environment and share those models and the descriptions to anyone. I can export them out in Excel files and whatnot, but I'm not going to touch that right now. That is a very, very quick overview of the main features of Ellie and how you draw things with it. Let me just go back to my slides here. There we go. Yes. So now you saw creating that sort of a model. I think creating that example model maybe took me 10 or 15 minutes, something like that. Usually we're doing this in brief workshops with business people. Moving on, the value of this. So we created a nice model. So what do we get out of it? The idea is that, as Alex said, you can basically do anything with data models. So no matter what the project is, you need to understand the data contents. And you want to ensure that the data is based on real-life business things, not your IT systems. You want the business and the IT departments to be able to discuss. You want the business departments to be able to discuss by defining common terminology and understandable structures, so everyone can read that and see that, okay, this is how these things are linked in real world. And you can use the models to basically specify requirements for a project, for a data initiative, or identify gaps that you should have data about these things, but you actually don't. So these benefits are basically something that you can realize in any kind of a project. But I have listed here a few possible use cases, and there's lots of text here. I'm not going to go through everything here, but a few possible use cases in which data modeling is useful. You could be building an AI model of something. You want to understand the requirements of what kinds of data do you need that to utilize in order to get the result out. And you would probably want to discuss with your business users about the data contents and then serve the data, the results from your fancy AI thing to the business users in terms and structures they can understand. But this time we will be focusing mostly on this data platform thing. And I think the number one point that I want to make here is that when building a data platform, we have these fancy cloud-based tools and great technology to store huge amounts of data, but you cannot approach these as purely technological solutions. That will not help you actually get anything out of it. The real thing here is that you want to get the business benefits to materialize, and that's not possible if the data cannot be easily linked to the actual business needs. So I have written down a few principles here, or rules. And number one rule would be that you need to understand what data you have available in the organization before you even think about, the technological solution of data storages, for example. That is kind of the one key thing. Understand what data you have before you start figuring out how do you want to put all of your terabytes of data into a data platform or data lake or something. If you don't understand the data, you're creating a data swamp. So no one can find anything. You don't know what you really have. The second rule here is that usually now data warehousing is not dead, as we all know. It's usually incorporated into these modern data platforms. And even though the kind of data lake layer could store vast amounts of unstructured and unprocessed data, the data warehouse itself should be designed according to the real business concepts and not the technical solutions that might be your source systems, your SAP systems, your CRMs or something. The data warehouse in the middle of your platform should be designed according to the business concepts, which you can again identify by doing the conceptual models. So this is rule number 2. And rule number 3 on the other end of the data platform basically is that you want to serve your business users with data they can understand. And this means common terminology, structures that have been kind of figured out together with the business users. And this enables you to shorten the gap that usually exists between the actual data and then the action which produces the business benefit. So we'll get back to that a little bit later for further comment also. But 3 rules, so you want to get the data that you understand on your platform. You want to design your data warehouses according to business concepts, not source systems, and you want your users to actually see what the data is for real and to be able to connect that into their business needs. So drawing this out in a slightly complicated, but still I think very pretty picture, the very simplified data platform architecture here in the middle, saying that you have a data lake that stores the raw data. You have a data vault structure here. It could be not data vault, it could be something else. It's usually data vault if you want to go fully modernized data platform, data warehousing stack. And then you have various use cases for reporting, analytics, whatever. And our vision here is that the understanding from the business, which acts as the source of all this data, needs to feed into these business-driven conceptual data models that you create in Ellie. And the understanding of the requirements of the business, the needs of the business need to affect that also, so that you can then decide, okay, understand what data I have, what should we have available, what do we put in the data lake, no matter what the technological form of it is. What is the data vault structure? So how we design a data warehouse which is kind of stable and not changing every time that a source system changes. And what data should we provide for the actual business users for each use case? And all of these answers we can get by doing conceptual data modeling. So that's the vision that we have in Ellie regarding these data platforms. An example of technology stack, so I've been talking against technology a lot, but let's mention some technological terms here. So our idea is that you are kind of catching the real business needs with Ellie, and you can feed that into various development tools, like, for example, Warescape. If you're building a data vault, you can plug in basically the models from Ellie into Warescape, which creates a data model which is physically implemented in something like Snowflake, which data then is utilized with a tool, for example, like Power BI, which still kind of follows the same principles and terminology and structures from your Ellie-based conceptual data models, which then produces actionable data to the business itself. So this is an example technology stack and the kind of location of Ellie there between the business needs and the actual technological implementation. In process terms, it could look something like this. So you might have a business process of which you create kind of a generic overall model, what we call a domain model. And then you have a particular business problem that you are trying to solve, of which you then create a more detailed and more limited scope of a use case model in Ellie. And the use case model then should affect the way you're actually doing data development. So what is the physical database or data feed or whatever you're building, which then produces the data for utilization. And both the physical implementation of the kind of data storage and especially the implementation of the data in the utilization layer, which faces the business users, should follow the business-driven models that you have created together with the business. And this is the way to ensure that your entire data pipeline follows the principles of the business-driven models in order to make the data usable, make the data understandable. This also goes especially with Data Vault. Our idea is that you want to use actual business concepts as the core of your Data Vault design. So avoid source system data vaults, that's not good. You create a business-driven model of those things in Ellie. You utilize some rules and parameters on how to create hubs and everything out of that. And then, for example, we have an integration with Warescape. You can pull that in and then create a data vault model based on that. So you're getting a kind of well-documented model which is based on something that the business actually understands, so it's easier to utilize also. And there are all kinds of automation options based on Ellie outputs there. In the end, the key problem that we have is here. So there's a gap between the business and the data. And as data people, we kind of have that problem that we like to talk about technology. We like to talk about data lakes and data pipelines and all kinds of fancy data ops things. But the problem is that if we start with the data, we're not getting anywhere. We have to start with the business in order to get this whole loop working here, to get the business benefits realized from the actions that we can take based on some actual data. So we think that this is the solution. We put Ellie in between the business and the data. We do the conceptual data models. We create models based on what we understand that happens actually in the business. We link that to the actual physical data. And then when creating then analytics and getting the insights and even doing the decisions based on that data, we have a much easier time to figure out what the data is supposed to be. So that's kind of our promise there, that we want to make this actually easier. We want to make the action happen. We want to get the business benefit out. And we are saying that the solution for that lies here between the business and the data, improving that communication, improving that understanding of the data asset, and making it not only an IT thing, but making it something that the business also sees and understands in their everyday life. So that's, I think, the last slide that I'd like everyone to remember here. This is where we are. This is the position that we want to be in. Now it would be time for questions and answers, I think. I think we got a couple. There was an earlier question that, yes, Alec, this is probably good for you too, saying, are we also trying to model the language in the business? This was one of the questions that we had.
Yes, we are. I think
So, yeah.
concept modeling is fundamentally about language. I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but you know, we human beings are great at communicating with, you know, with context and assumptions. But when you actually get down to that important question, what do you actually mean by something, you find that people are using the same term in very different ways. So I believe that concept modeling is very much about language.
I fully agree, and I wouldn't go as far as, you know, trying to identify, you know, linguistic structures here with conceptual models. But there's one thing that I've learned, and the key thing here is that when you're describing a business process, the nouns in that descriptions, that's usually where you can find the things. So
absolutely,
you're saying that a client walks into an office. So you have client and office; those are things. You can count them, you can understand them, you can model them, and then the verbs usually become relationships.
That is so true, and in fact, in my business process workshops, I teach kind of a concept model based approach to discovering your business processes. Because once you have a thing, you know, like a student at a university, then you can simply ask, well, what are the verbs that go with student? Okay, well, we identify a student, we recruit a student, we assess a student, we admit a student, we enroll a student, we register a student. And so once you have the thing, that's a great starting point for discovering your business processes or the services that you need out of your applications.
Absolutely, yes. So I think the short answer for that language question would be yes, absolutely, we are modeling the language here.
Yes, we are. And can I just want to jump in with something else. Sure. We will, I believe, make a PDF of our presentation available afterwards.
Certainly.
Okay, good. Because there was, I think, a couple of questions about that.
Yes, the material will be shared, the recording will be shared. And
we're all about sharing.
Yes, we're all about sharing. There was another bit more specific question about Ellie. Is Ellie going to play a part in physical modeling? That I have to answer with a no. So the point of Ellie is not to model your databases with it. We are very much in this conceptual, logical modeling space where we want to be able to do modeling with business, not necessarily with DBAs. That being said, of course, the process leads from these business-driven models that you create with Ellie into these physical solutions, and we are looking into various integrations that might help your life there, like the one with Wescape. But the point of Ellie is not to act as a database design tool. So physical modeling is not really our thing in that sense.
Yeah, and that is a well-traveled space. So if you can export a model from Ellie into one of the other modeling tools, and you know, I'll just make a personal statement here. A lot of data modeling tools are actually physical database design tools. And if you can you can work with the business in Ellie and then export what you've discovered into one of these other tools, then you can generate first cut physical designs for any number of platforms.
True. That's a good point. There's a question on how do we validate the conceptual model. That's a good thing to ask. I think the kind of agility and iterative nature of this process is something that we didn't really touch on, Alec, did we?
Right. There was. Oh boy, I'm tempted to do a screen share here to answer that, but I would be fumbling around. But the main idea is I validate the model, first of all, by simply walking through the model, not as if it is a data model, but simply a description of a business with business stakeholders, and ask them if they feel that is an accurate representation. But then to validate it, I start bringing in other perspectives. Does the model handle the business events and services that I have identified? Does the data model support the business processes? Does each step in the business process have access to the data it needs and a place to capture the data that it records? What about our queries, our reporting, and our analytics? So the key to validating the model is to shift out of data modeling mode and start looking at the model from other perspectives.
That's good. Yeah, one thing that I've used also is kind of, like smoke testing the model with a reporting use case. So you might have something that there's an analyst who says that they need to get sales transactions from these and these countries, and only in those cases where a particular product has been bought and something like that. And they come with this explanation, and you might have a model of the sales process or the data within the sales process. And you can go through that at point at the entities that, yes, you need this entity's data, and you want to filter it with that, and then you need that also to be connected. And if there's something that they are requiring which you cannot pinpoint from the model, then you are lacking something. So I think that's usually also a good way of testing the model. Did I catch everything that is usually required in these use cases?
Yeah. And if I can jump in there, Juha, that's also a great way to market or sell your model. So I have worked over the years with data management groups that did some maybe behind the scenes kind of guerrilla modeling, and then we took the model out on the road and we would ask groups like, say, marketing and salespeople, what is a question that you would like answered that you just can't get from our current environment? And then we walk through the model and show, hey, if we implemented this, you could get that answer. You could understand the chain of ownership, for instance, and the customers you're dealing with. You could understand, well, I won't go any further, but that's starting with the need and then showing how the fundamental data model is such an important point. A really good core data model can answer an infinite number of questions. Well, that's an exaggeration, but I'll leave it at that.
It should, because you are modeling the real life business there. So you're not modeling a kind of limited system. You should be modeling basically the real life of the business.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important.
For some use cases, you might be creating a kind of a limited scope model that only defines the kind of data that you have in some particular use case. Okay, that's also possible. But for kind of gap analysis, it's often useful to just model everything that you should have relating to a business process.
And that's why the most difficult thing for many business people is separating the fundamental things or entities or business objects from the artifacts, because they may live and die by artifacts, a particular report or spreadsheet. But what we need to help people do is shift to this perspective that if I had information about these fundamental things, then there's a whole galaxy of possible artifacts I can produce.
True, absolutely true. I think we have time for one more at least. There's a question on business glossaries and Ellie. So the business glossary in Ellie basically is kind of automatically created as you model. So all the entities, all the things you create go into that glossary. And as you write down the descriptions, you figure out what do you mean by a customer, you write it down into the glossary, and it's there, and it's kind of reused all the time for all the models that you create in Ellie. So there is just one glossary, there is just one customer entity which you are reusing once you've defined it once. There are other ways of doing business glossaries, of course. Data catalogs are interesting and very, very hot these days. So they are often registering the physical data, and you might be registering some business terms which are not kind of really entities, but they might be some more complicated concepts or attributes like ROI or something like that, which you would put in that kind of a glossary perhaps.
Yeah.
And we are looking into all kinds of fancy interactions there. And we have a case already in real life where the business glossary and the models from Ellie are basically taken out and inputted into a data catalog where they kind of form the basis of a wider business glossary of all kinds of business terms. So that
and can I just jump in and say, like, again, there's no shame in asking, what do you mean by? One of my favorite examples was a major credit card issuer in America. The CEO wanted to know, how many customers do we have? Well, it turned out everybody had a wildly different idea of what a customer was. Was it a card holder? Was it a merchant? Was it the card? Was it an account? And so when you ask these questions and you build the glossary, the number of different perspectives will surprise everybody.
True. And I think related to this, one last question, I think there was one about business terms and entities. There was a question of, can I link one business term to multiple entities? And now we're getting into this very interesting territory of synonyms and so on, that I would say that the philosophy in Ellie is that one word means one entity. So we want to make kind of very clear that when you are talking about customers, you are talking about these particular kinds of customers that you have defined. Then you have to find a new word for some other kind of customer, which might be, you could use, for example, like person customers and company customers or whatever, things like that. But,
I have many thoughts on this topic. Yeah. I almost want to do a whole an additional webinar on just how do we define things.
True.
Because I have a very specific, a simple but specific structure for defining, what is a customer, what is a site, and so on. But I think we're just about out of time.
We are.
And I see the whole gang is here in chat. That's great to see. Perfect.
We are indeed running out of time. I think it's time for us to wrap this up. Thank you, Alec, for everything. This has been absolutely great. Great to have you there. We will be sending out the presentations in PDF form later, I hope as soon as possible. This recording will be made available to everyone who registered, and there will be more. So we will be producing more of these webinars. And if you have ideas of topics you'd like to hear about, people you'd like to see, or if you are a person who might want to join us here in these webinars, do contact us. We have sales info and contact info, YouTube link there. We have a fancy new YouTube channel. I'm talking there. And these are going to be also in the material that will be sent to you. So do reach out, and we'll see you around. Thanks a lot, Alec.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity. Always great to be with my friends in Helsinki, in Northern Europe, and all over the globe. Thanks for the chance.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.